Good morning. Hello. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, The Plant Hunter. I'm Vanessa Sellers, Director of the Humanities Institute at the New York Botanical Garden. And together with my colleagues, Dr. Ina van der Broek and Charles Zimmerman, it's my great pleasure to welcome you from locations across the United States and around the globe. The New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape, the Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. Today's conversation is focusing on an important newly published book by Dr. Cassandra Quave, who describes the amazing quest for nature's next medicines, from the Amazon forest to the mountaintops in Albania. And to introduce today's speaker and her work in much further detail, it is my pleasure to hand over the microphone to our own acclaimed ethnobotanist, Dr. Ina van der Broek, Associate Curator and Caribbean Program Director at the New York Botanical Garden, whom I've had the privilege with to run various collaborative programs which relate plants and people in a broader humanistic context. Here is Dr. van der Broek.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and a warm welcome to everyone for tuning in. Today, you are all in for quite a treat, as I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing our speaker, my colleague and friend, Dr. Cassandra Quave. In short, Cassie, as our friends like to call her. Let me first start by reading her bio. Dr. Cassandra Quave, PhD, is the herbarium curator and an associate professor of dermatology and human health at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She's also the co-founder and CEO, CSO of Phytotech LLC, a drug discovery company dedicated to developing solutions from botanicals for the treatment of recalcitrant antibiotic-resistant infections. Dr. Quave is a fellow of the Explorers Club, a former president of the Society for Economic Botany, and a recipient of the Emory Williams Teaching Award and Charles Hazer Jr. Mentor Award. She is the co-creator and host of the podcast Foodie Pharmacology, that is dedicated to exploring the links between food and medicine. Please do check out this wonderful podcast. I highly recommend it. She is a leader in the fields of medical botany and ethnopharmacology and studies the bioactivity of medicinal plant extracts. She has authored more than 100 scientific publications and has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, BBC Focus, PBS, NPR, National Geographic TV, and The Guardian. Wow, that is no small feat. Let me now continue with a few personal words about Dr. Quave's work. As Vanessa said in the beginning, I'm an ethnobotanist here at the Garden who studies traditional knowledge and use of plants as medicines and foods. And thus I follow Dr. Quave's publications closely and also share them with my students for reading and discussion in class. One of my favorite papers, published in Nature Plants in 2015, is the one in which Dr. Quave, together with Dr. Andrea Pieroni, another ethnobotanist friend and colleague, investigated how two cultural groups living within the same geographic landscape in the Balkans, more precisely in northeastern Albania, interact with their plant resources. The research data that Dr. Quave and Dr. Pieroni gathered demonstrated that medicinal and ritual plant use was quite different in these two cultural groups, even though they lived in the same environment. However, their data also revealed that when it comes to food security and mechanisms for coping with famine, ethnobotanical knowledge was far less associated with one specific cultural group, and instead was more widespread and thus shared across cultures. Dr. Quave and Dr. Pieroni concluded that such an understanding of the human-nature interface is critical to the future design of culturally appropriate, sustainable economic development and health promotion initiatives. This influential paper is just one of many examples of how Dr. Quave's work is shaping the field of ethnobotany. Another example is that my current graduate student, Ella Vardaman, was a summer research intern with Dr. Quave in 2018. I'm pretty sure that this was a profound experience that set her out on a path of pursuing graduate studies in ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology. Indeed, it takes a village to train an ethnobotanist, and we are lucky to have Dr. Quave to help us do just that. From reading her book, it became clear to me that her own career path and life trajectory have made her into the fierce and accomplished plant scientist that she is today. But I don't want to give away more than I should. And instead, I'd now like to give the word to Dr. Quave to take you on a personal journey of plants, people, culture, and last but not least, science. Please go ahead, Cassie.
Thank you, Dr. van der Roex, for such a beautiful and warm welcome. And thank you to the Gardens, to NYVG for hosting me for this wonderful event. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to see that we have, a great number of folks in the audience, and I look forward to also answering your questions at the end of the presentation. And so I'll go ahead and begin by sharing some highlights from my new book, The Plant Hunter. It was just released on October 19th, and it is available today now in the US, Canada, and the UK in hardback, audiobook, and also as an electronic book. And so to begin, I'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the sections that I'll cover. And I've structured the book in this way. The first section is on nature, the second on infection, and the third on medicine. And I've just picked a few highlights from these sections to discuss with you all today, to give you a flavor of the kind of work that we do, and really to give you some perspective on the journey that I took in becoming an ethnobotanist. Much like Dr. van der Roeck noted, it takes a village to raise an ethnobotanist, and there have been so many incredibly influential scientists and healers that I've worked with over the years that have really shaped me into the scientist that I am today. And so this is very much a part of their story as well as it is mine. And so I'll begin with our discussion of nature and with the very, very early days of my introduction into this world. So these are my parents. This is my father, my mother and father, and then me in my first year of life. I've had a very unusual childhood. I was born with multiple congenital skeletal defects, which included missing bones in my leg. I also had the bones that I did have on my right leg were very short and underdeveloped. And as I grew older, I also developed a number of other problems that required the extension of my femur, my hip to be rebuilt a few times, and also my back to be straightened due to very severe scoliosis. And so, this book is about ethnobotany, but it's also very much a story of resilience and of really gratitude for amazing medical interventions that allow me today to be a scientist and explorer, and to have the physical ability to get out in the world in spite of some of these early challenges in my life. I wanted to just show you what the disability looked like, and I found these early childhood photos. This is pre-amputation. So my leg was amputated at the age of 3 with the hopes of giving me better opportunities to walk. Because of the differences in my limb disparity, you can see there was this large kind of block that I had to wear under shoes with extensive braces. The challenge was, because I was missing bones in my foot, and I also was missing my fibula, which is that bone that goes behind your where your calf muscle is, there was risk of, having frequent breaks of those bones. And so at the age of 3, they decided to amputate the leg so that I could then be better able to walk with a prosthetic. However, because of recurring problems that I had with my bones throughout childhood, I was often on crutches, but that didn't stop me. I had great upper body strength. I could out arm wrestle any boy in my class, at least until they hit puberty, just from being on crutches all the time. And I spent a lot of my time outdoors with my dogs, and also really starting to take note of the natural world. Many of my days were spent in South Florida, just looking at the creatures swimming around in the water, or sitting in a tree and watching insects and birds and examining the plants. And from a very early age, I was just fascinated with observing all these natural phenomena. But it wasn't really until the 3rd grade and when my mother this microscope that she borrowed from the high school. My mom is a school teacher. And when I was first looked through the microscope, it was like an entire other world was opened up to me. I'd already been very fascinated with looking at nature, but here was something that gave me a lens into the unseen. And that was just incredibly transformational for me. And my interest in the unseen and in microbiology continued to grow through high school. As I got more and more interested in different projects that involved the study of drug-resistant bacteria. And so I grew up in a very rural cow town where really raising beef cattle and growing orange groves was the main source of the local economy. And this is a time when there were massive outbreaks of a particularly pathogenic strain of E. coli that was killing people or making them extremely ill. And this was being, people were being infected with this following consumption of undercooked ground beef. And so this became something of a personal fascination for me. I wanted to understand how bacteria could play a role in kind of in food, and which types of ground beef, which providers would have higher levels of these really dangerous bacteria in them. And from there, I was fortunate to be taken under the wing of a really wonderful woman who ran the clinical microbiology laboratory at a small local hospital. And she began to teach me the things that I teach my students today, even in college, of how to culture bacteria, how to grow them out, how to enumerate them, count them, and also how to test their antibiotic sensitivities. And so I really became very fascinated with antibiotic resistance in this period. I was also very much driven by participation in the science fair. And in some ways, I don't think I ever really stopped doing science fair. I know that these days, many parents groan at the idea of, having to do a science fair project with their kids. But for me, it was really the gateway out of my very small town into meeting people from all around the world that were as fascinated with science as I was. And I can't understate the incredible importance of those experiences of meeting other students at both the state and international level. When I went to college, I was pre-med. I was very much focused on this idea of following in my hero's footsteps. I had 1, sometimes 2 surgeries a year from the age of 3 to 18, and then sporadically after that. And so my heroes were my surgeons, and I wanted to be like them. And so I began studying the pre-medical course load. I was majoring in biology, but I also kind of fell into the field of anthropology. Anthropology for me was kind of my fun course. It was the coursework that was really stimulating to me and very enjoyable. And I enjoyed it so much that I ended up doing a second major in that field. But it wasn't until almost my senior year of college, the second semester of my junior year, that I first read about the field of ethnobotany. I'd never heard of ethnobotany before, but all of a sudden, here is something that brings together both my fascination with nature and also offers a window into understanding how people interface with nature. And for me, the most interesting part was how they interface with nature for medicine. And so ethnobotany has been described as the science of survival, and it really gripped me. And I had a professor at the time who took students to the Amazon on a kind of spring break trip each year. This was out of my price range. I couldn't afford to go. But amazingly, there was a way, a cheaper way for me to go at a much discounted rate to work in the research camp as a volunteer intern. And so when I learned about that, I leapt at it. And that's when I took my first trip to the Peruvian Amazon. So this was the summer of 1999. I just turned 21. I spoke a little bit of broken Spanish, but I was studying and really trying to absorb as much as I could. When I went to Peru, landed in Iquitos, traveled up the Napo near the Ecuadorian border, and stayed at the Explorama lodges in the Asir camp, which was the research camp at the time. My job was to work with this gentleman. This is Don Antonio Montero Pisco. He is a medicine man, a shaman, a curandero. He's also known as an ayahuasquero shaman. He really became such an influential person in my life, a friend, a teacher, and someone that really opened my eyes to the myriad ways that medicine can be practiced. Until this point, my perspective of medicine was based on my own personal experience. And remember, I had a lot of experience from being in the hospital for surgeries every year. And from my experiences, really medicine was surgery and pharmacology, right? Medicine and cutting. That was it. There wasn't in between, nothing that really addressed spirituality or kind of holistic care. But working with Don Antonio, I began to not only appreciate the fact that medicine can come from nature, but also that it's much about many more things than just surgery and pharmacy. In addition to working with Don Antonio, I became fascinated in meeting with local mothers that lived in ribereño villages. So these are communities that are situated along the main river, but which no longer really maintain an ethnic identity with different indigenous groups of the region. And this region has indigenous groups, including the Maihuna people and the Yagua people. But those that live along this main riverbank really lost those connections. And importantly, they've also lost much of the knowledge of how to use the plants in their environment as a source of medicine. I became really particularly interested in understanding how this intersection between Western medicine and traditional medicine influenced child health. And what I found was that there had been a chasm left in the wake of introduction of pills to treat, for example, intestinal parasites. And when they ran out of pills, there was no traditional knowledge left to fill in that gap, and children's health suffered for it. Now, some of the other major lessons that I learned early on was that plants are incredibly important to global health care. Today, I lead a research group that's focused on the discovery of new medicines derived from plants, but our work is about much more than drug discovery. It's also about validation of traditional medicines, of trying to glean the information of not only do these plants work, how do they work, which compounds are responsible, and what mechanisms do those compounds elicit on different physiological systems. This is really important, not just again for drug discovery, but it's important to return this knowledge on efficacy and safety to the many, many people across the globe that rely on plants as their primary form of medicine. This is not something that is a supplement or something that's used as an integrative approach, perhaps to a Western medicine, but instead this is their main form of medicine. And billions of people across the globe use plants for this purpose. And at the same time, many of these species are at risk due to of human populations, expansion, especially of industrial agriculture, transition of forests and ecosystems into agricultural lands, over-harvesting of wild plants, and of course, climate change are putting all of these at risk. What also really amazed me during these early days of my studies was the fact that there was so very much diversity on life. Today, there's an estimated 374,000 species of plants on Earth. Others have estimated up to 390,000, but we're somewhere in that range. And what's amazing to me is that out of those, roughly 9% or over 33,000 of all plants on Earth have at some point been documented as being used in some form of traditional medicine. That's just amazing. It's amazing that people from cultures from across the globe have systematically sorted through the diversity of life and identified these plants. But what's shocking is the fact that when it comes to Western science, we've barely scratched the surface of understanding and investigating these species. For the most part, we have no idea if these plants work, how safe they are, or what mechanisms are at play. Of those plants, though, that we have studied, some of the results have been incredible. Here are just a few examples of plants that can be found in the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. We have medications for pain, such as codeine and morphine, medications for malaria like quinine and artemisinin, for cancer, for heart disease. The list goes on. And I think this is really important for people to remember. And that was one of the goals of my book, was to really remind people, both in the lay public and scientists, remind them that the chemical blueprints on which many of our drugs are based were originally discovered in plants. Today, there's an estimated 60% of all pharmaceuticals are either derived from or inspired by natural products. So while not all come from plants in this case, many of them do. And all of these, again, are coming from inspiration from nature. However, there is a sense of urgency that we can't ignore. Many medicinal plants are under threat. Many plants in general are under threat. I was one of the scientists that across the globe, there were over 210 scientists from across the globe that contributed to the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens State of the World's Plants, the 2020 report. And one of the findings from that report is that 10 in 5 plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction. We have a lot of work to do, not only to save the knowledge about how these plants are used, but also to work with local people to ensure that their local habitats are also saved. Now I'm going to shift into the second part of the book, which is focused on infection, and I'm going to go back to the past. So when I was 3, I had this amputation in order to allow me to walk with a prosthetic. Everything went well until I came home, and a few days later, my mother smelled something awful coming from the bandage. And when she unwrapped it, she discovered that I had a horrific infection and I had to be rushed back to the hospital. I had a staph infection that had destroyed the tissues around the bone and required many more weeks of hospitalization and additional surgeries to revise the bone. Luckily, this was an infection in the early 1980s, a variation of staph that was not yet multiple drug resistant as the ones we have today. Had this infection happened in today's world, in today's level of modern science, I may not have survived. That's because over 700,000 people die due to antimicrobial resistant infections. We've only had antibiotics for less than a century, and in that time, we have not been good stewards of these life-saving drugs. We've recklessly used them in agriculture, animal feed supplements, and even in agriculture for cultivation of plants. Amazingly, due to the outbreaks of citrus canker in recent years, they've been spraying orange groves with huge amounts of tetracycline-based compounds. This is just one example of how we're using these in a large scale. We also have issues with compliance and adhering to the therapies, but overall, the real challenge is the way the antibiotics work. They work by placing direct selective pressure on the ability of microbes to survive. And as mutants arise, these can spread to other people and cause more and more difficult infections to treat. By the year 2050, it's estimated that we'll have 10 million deaths per year due to these types of infections. That's 5 times the number of deaths that were suffered during the first year of COVID-19. And so the other challenges are not only in the scientific side of the need to discover and refill those drug discovery pipelines, but we're also suffering a cataclysmic failure of the economic model that supports antibiotic discovery and development. I go into this more in the book. I'm not going to spend too much time on this in today's presentation, but I just wanted to bring this up as an example of some of the challenges that we currently face. So the next question, could plants be the solution? And as you're probably guessing, I believe so. let's talk about medicine. In my research laboratory, we take an ethnobotanical approach to drug discovery. So we start with ethnobotanical information that is collected either through interviews with people that are using plants as medicine today, or through evaluating historic records of plant use. We've gone back and looked at historic traditional Chinese medical texts. We've also looked at, for example, old texts in Latin that documented the notations of explorers in South America in the 1600s. And from these texts or from these interviews, we're able to glean clues as to which of those 33,000 species that are used in some form of medicine might just be the best leads for finding new treatments for infection. We identify the plants, we collect them. We have a multidisciplinary team that not only includes a botanist, but also scientists that focus more on the areas of pharmacology and microbiology and natural products chemistry. We go through this process of basically making extracts of the plants, we test them in biological assays, and then we go through this process of bioassay-guided fractionation with the goal in mind of identifying many compounds in these complex mixtures that might be responsible for the desired outcome. It's a very long process, and our expertise really ends about here. At this stage where we need to hand off our molecules to work in collaboration with medicinal chemists and clinical trialists that could someday run these through studies in humans. Some of the things that are really important when you think about the early stages of the ethnobotanical drug discovery initiative, and that's the emphasis on ethics. We have to do this work under strict codes of ethics with prior informed consent and in compliance with the Convention of Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol for Access and Benefit Sharing. What this means basically is that we're getting away from the historic colonial approaches in which scientists or explorers would go into an area, take what they wanted, leave the community with nothing, no form of benefit, and in some cases, actually a great deal of pain and suffering. And so this is the polar opposite of how ethnobotany is conducted today. And a lot of our emphasis is also on how do we foster research capacity building, and I'll tell you why. Today, there are around 36 terrestrial global hotspots of biodiversity. These are areas in the world highlighted in brown that are known to have incredibly rich species diversity. So 1,500 endemic species or more in these locations. So endemic species are species only found in certain parts of the world. These also are places where 70% of the native vegetation is under threat or has been lost. So there's an urgency to working in these areas. You can see the little yellow stars that are represented here. Each of these stars represents places where we've done our work ourselves with our research team, or also working with collaborators under collaborative research agreements in universities based in these different locations. My dream someday is to build an international collaborative network that has collaborations in place with each of these biodiversity hotspots so that we can all really unify our efforts to study these 33,000 species, to realize their full pharmacological potential before we lose the chance to. Some of the challenges for scientists that live and work in these biodiversity hotspots is access to the research tools that are available, for example, to me in my laboratory or at my university. And so a lot of these initiatives, we also carefully go into long stages of planning to ensure that we can have academic exchange of having students and professors get opportunities for training on these advanced pieces of equipment, and also working on collaborative research grant proposals together in order that they might also build up their research infrastructure through the purchase of new equipment to enable the study of plants in the country. I'll take you through some of my different field sites, beginning with the first collaborative work I did with Professor Andrea Pironi, who's an Italian ethnobotanist and also really a leader in the field when it comes to the understanding of the relationships that people have with wild foods and the importance of wild food to local culture and health. When we met in 2000 at a conference, it was the International Conference of Ethnobiology. It was the first conference I'd been to after college, and it was a place where I presented my research on the Amazon. There, Professor Andrea Pironi and I became friends, and he invited me to come and join his research team in this small village of Ginestra, Italy. This village is unique because it's an ethnic minority, has an ethnic minority population known as the Arboresh. These people are descendants of Albanians that escaped the Turkish Ottoman invasion of the Balkans in the 1500s, and they came in a number of migration waves to southern Italy over the centuries that followed. Some of our early work was actually incredibly fun. I had an intensive boot camp at learning how to speak Italian. I had based those skills off of my Spanish speaking, and now I learned Italian working with Andrea and with local people. And our job was really working in collaboration, especially with local elders, learning about these wild foods, having the amazing opportunity to taste many of these wild foods that have been transformed into these amazing dishes. I also became very interested during this time together as I began to get to know different healers that worked in the region. And so, like Don Antonio, while obviously Italy is very different from the Amazon, there were really interesting practices with spiritual healing. And this is Zia Elena, who is one of the healers that I worked intensively with. She was what we would call a master healer, someone that knew how to heal many different variations of spiritually afflicted diseases, or for which they attributed a spiritual ailment to. She also used plants in these rituals, and a lot of these were for the treatment of a number of different skin diseases. And so my study with her and evaluation of different skin diseases really led me later in my doctoral work to focus on the skin as a target of interest. Now, in addition to doing research in the area, life happened and I met a wonderful man who became my husband in the village of Ginestra. And so it's amazing how life can take you down these paths. I probably would have never gone to that village had it not been for that chance meeting with Andrea. We now have 4 beautiful kids. And this is one of my children I had in the field with me when I was doing my graduate work in the village. One of the challenges, of course, in having both a family and a career is there are a lot of challenges of juggling it all, of trying to make sure that your family stays first, by also giving your passion the time and energy that it needs. And I write about this in the book as well, of how this kind of played out in my personal experience. As time went on, I expanded my research sites, and as my kids got older, they also continued to come with me in the field. This is an example from our work with Professor Alessandro Saita, who is a mycologist from Sicily, and also Professor Alfonso La Rosa, who's a naturalist. And so I've really tried in all cases to work with local scientists whenever we have an international expedition. And these are ongoing multiple year collaborations, and continue to collaborate together in these efforts. Here in the Southeast US, I've also had some amazing opportunities to work with our teams of students. And again, my kids, here we're wearing snake gaiters. This happens to be a location where there are a lot of rattlesnakes. We have to be very careful when working in these longleaf pine habitats. But just really beautiful opportunities, even here in the US. You don't always have to go abroad to really study some incredible biodiversity of the landscapes. In Albania and Kosovo, again, working with Andrea, I had amazing opportunities to explore some of northeastern Albania, and also build a deeper collaboration with scientists like Professor Agni Haidari from the University of Pristina. Here we are in an ethnic minority village. These are known as the Gorani people, high in the alpine region of the Shari Mountains. I've learned so much from these studies, and continue to have ongoing collaborations and friendships with the community members. Something that's important to note is that in addition to plant collecting, there's a lot of time that goes into interviewing local people. And this is perhaps one of my favorite parts of the job, is just getting a chance to sit and talk with people about their traditions and see them take that walk through memory lane of what plants they may have used in their childhood and which ones they continue to use today for everything from food to medicine. Another important lesson that I've learned is that teamwork is essential for field expeditions, whether it's with a team of students working close here to my university in Georgia or in Florida, or working with collaborators here like Alfonso or Alessandro in the islands around Sicily. It just makes the experience so much more enriching and productive. And I'm so very thankful to have these team members to work with. Throughout the book, I also talk about some of the challenges in doing field work. This is a picture from one of the most beautiful meadows I'd visited in a long time, high in the Shari Mountains, full of wildflowers and terrestrial orchids. It was just like a botanical wonderland, but also it was full of pollen, so I was constantly sneezing while I was out there. But the real challenge for me, of course, comes back to that disability. So, you know, I've been asked a number of times on book tour, like, why would you pick a career that's so difficult for you in terms of physical access as being a disabled person? And my answer has always been, it's my passion. I just never considered anything else. It's what brings happiness to me. It's what I enjoy doing. And while there are challenges, you know, there's also incredible joy that comes from this work. And I've found that with careful planning and with, you know, the right initiative and positive outlook, anything is really possible. And, you know, as a bit of a humorous point, you know, I always start my day with a very happy outlook, very excited, but the reality is by the evening, I'm pretty exhausted. The physical challenges of field work can be quite enduring and challenging even for people that, you know, don't have to also struggle with a disability while trying to get out into the field. So today, my research approach is really fully integrated. We have the field research aspects. I also curate the herbarium. These are examples of herbarium specimens. These are really important because herbarium specimens serve as a record of life, right? In a certain time and a certain place. And so these are really our records that allow for authentication of the plant extracts that we work on. Let's say if we found the next cure for something really important, it's important that we have that physical evidence to ensure that we know which species we're actually working on. In my phytochemistry lab at Emory, we extract those plants, so pull out the chemistry from materials. And then the microbiology and dermatology lab is where we study those extracts for activities, mainly against our infectious disease targets. Altogether, we have over 2,000 botanical and fungal extracts from more than 650 species. The library is incredibly diverse, so we wanted to have representation of many different clades on plant phylogeny, but it's also highly targeted because most of these are plants that are used in some form of traditional medicine for infectious and inflammatory disease. Again, going back to teamwork, I think that I can't overestimate the importance of having a diverse group, both in terms of personal diversity, but also in terms of diversity of scientific training. And this is not usual in the sciences. And I think this is something that ethnobotany as a field actually lends itself quite well to. And so you don't typically in a lab see a chemist sitting down with a botanist, sitting down with a microbiologist and a pharmacologist, but that's exactly what we do in our group. And it's what enables us to look at these challenging problems that we're trying to address from many different angles, because each of us brings a different form of training to the table. I don't claim to be an expert at any one of these fields, but what I am good at is I can speak the language of many different areas of science, just like, you know, speaking a language of different linguistics across the globe. Understanding how to speak those different scientific languages and how to interpret that information is really what I think has enabled our group to be so successful. We've also, again, put a lot of emphasis and in priority on ensuring that our interactions with local communities are equitable and that we're returning knowledge to communities and healers, because this is often one of the things that they really want to know most about. We've done this in the form of writing books in the local language that are accessible to communities and bringing those back to the communities. We've done it through workshops, through events planned in concert with different cultural organizations that work in the region. And again, also by directly interfacing with the healers that have informed our work. One of the big lessons that I've gleaned from my experience in science is that it really takes time and it takes stability. And unfortunately, our modern scientific infrastructure is not really set up in that way. Leaps in progress don't happen overnight. We really have to put more emphasis on stability in the system to ensure that we're given the opportunity to train the scientists of tomorrow, and that those scientists have pathways to pursue a career that can be both intellectually fulfilling, but also fulfilling in terms of being able to support their families. I'll just end with a few examples of some of the projects that we've worked on in the lab. This is one on the left where we've looked at ginkgo biloba, which many of you may recognize as a plant. The leaves are used in a number of dietary supplements to support mental acuity. But in traditional Chinese medicine, we actually found, I had a student that did this project, an undergraduate student, and she found some interesting reports in historic texts that describe the use of the seed coats of this plant. And so her project was based on the validation of whether or not these seeds applied to bacteria that are common in skin disease could actually have some efficacy. And indeed, she did find that there was some efficacy. However, she also found that there was some toxicity also to the human cells. And perhaps this is the reason why this remedy is no longer really in practice. I think it's an important recognition that traditional knowledge is constantly changing. It's a dynamic process that may shift and morph over time as it's shared from generation to generation. But traditional knowledge can also give us great clues into the chemistry and pharmacological potential of plants. Here's an example of some of our work that we've done with St. John's wort that's used commonly in the Balkans. These are some photos from Albania, or excuse me, from Kosovo, where it's made into an oil-based macerate or an oleolite formation. So basically the flowers, the flowering aerial tops are put into bottles with oil, cooking oil, it could be olive oil, and left in the sun for 40 days. Now, if you look at organic extracts of this particular plant, it has a compound that can cause pretty severe phototoxicity if it's taken and the person also is exposed to a lot of sunlight. And so our question was, if these people are putting this on their skin all the time, why aren't they having these, severe sunburns that is known to be a consequence of exposure to these compounds? And what we found was that the traditional means of preparing the plant, so not as a tea, not as an alcohol extract, but this peculiar way of leaving it in oil for 40 days in the sun, actually resulted in a formulation that has a very different chemical makeup than the types of extracts we might see in the herbal supplements aisle. And this chemical formulation lacked the compound that causes phototoxicity. So it was the original traditional formulation that ensured that they had an effective and safe form of how the plant is used. In other examples, we've done a lot of work on the Brazilian pepper tree. Of course, in Florida, this is a plant that's very much loathed. It's an invasive weedy species that people really don't like. But in the Brazilian pharmacopoeia has a very long history of use for the treatment of wounds and ulcers. And we found records of this also going into the 1600s in Historia Naturalis Brasiliae. When you look at the chemistry, the chemical makeup of the fruits, though, it can be quite complicated. And this is not unusual. Plant chemistry is, by its nature, very complex. And some of the challenges that we face, the bottlenecks, are really in separating and isolating those compounds so that we can pursue them in individual form. And this is something that Marco, who's both my husband and a really important part of the scientific research team, was able to solve by taking Lego parts. So this is just a Lego Mindstorms unit and some tools that he got from the hardware store. And he was basically able to recreate a piece of equipment that if purchased from a commercial vendor could be anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 in expense. And he was able to build this for under $500. And we've since then been very successful in isolating a number of these compounds just by the ability that this gives us to kind of apply brute force technology to repetitively isolate those in large enough amounts to get sufficient compound for isolation and structural elucidation. Again, this is another how we've returned information to help foster research capacity building. We published a paper on this, included a YouTube video on how to build and how to use the piece of equipment. And I've gotten emails from people from all across the globe, all the way from New Zealand to Germany to South America, that have really been able to use this to speed up their process. And it's been really successful. So when it came to the pepper tree, we were able to not only isolate enough of these compounds in pure form to get data by NMR, but also they were so pure that they naturally formed crystals. And so through X-ray, single crystal X-ray crystallography, we were able to determine the full 3D conformation of these, enabling us to really expand our study into how these molecules might work. One last example I'll show you is this work that we've done with the American beautyberry. This is a beautiful plant currently in fruit here in South Georgia, throughout the state of Georgia. And we found records of its use as a skin remedy and decided to study this. And what we found was not only does it have constituents that act as antimicrobial compounds against staph bacteria, but this compound in particular not only acts as an antimicrobial, but it also restores the activity of other antibiotics that no longer work. And so this is opening up whole new doorways for us to explore of how some of these plant-derived compounds might be used in the future to make our currently non-functioning antibiotics work again, to take them back off the shelves so that we can use those again effectively. And so altogether, this book is a story of my journey in science. It's a personal journey. I hope that people will walk away with a greater appreciation for nature and a greater appreciation for where many of our medicines come from, and perhaps a burning drive to want to help and save some of these habitats and save the languages and the cultures of people that hold this immense knowledge of the natural world. I want to thank my amazing research team that continue to inspire me. I think one of the best things about my job is that not only do I get to continue to learn from colleagues in the scientific community, but also from all the healers and community members that I work with, and even from my students. There's so many different perspectives that I get a chance to become exposed to, and it's just been really such a pleasure. If you're looking for additional information also in the field of ethnobotany, I encourage you to check out the Foodie Pharmacology podcast, which you can find on all of your podcast streaming platforms, and also the Teach Ethnobotany channel, where I've uploaded a number of my lectures, and we also have some short lectures from Society for Economic Botany and Society of Ethnobiology conferences that are also posted there. And I thank you so much. I'll take questions now if we have any. So while we're kind of getting set up, I'm seeing some questions come through the chat on antivirals. We are working on COVID-19 in the lab. We're not quite ready to publish our results, but I can give you the update that we successfully screened almost 2,000 extracts and identified 3 that show some potential and also have favorable safety profiles. These extracts are undergoing additional testing right now to evaluate if they are in live virus models. We did our initial screen with just a piece of the virus with the spike protein. So that's the extent of our antiviral testing right now.
Hi, Cassandra, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm Charles Zimmerman, by the way. I'm taking over Vanessa Sellers for our Q&A. We have some great questions here in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'm gonna go ahead and read some of the top questions that we have. Dr. Quave, thank you.
Great.
So we'll start with the beginning. So do you also study the cultural practices that go along with the medicines and compounds that you're talking about? I read Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice by Plotkin, and it seems like some of the treatments he describes could be more effective because of the ceremony associated with that treatment. So what are your thoughts on that question?
Absolutely. And I read Mark's book. Actually, that was one of the book that I read for my assigned reading as a college student that really introduced me to ethnobotany. So yes, absolutely. The ceremonial and ritual aspects to healing are incredibly important. And, this is not restricted just to Amazonian shamanism, but also, when we look at, as I mentioned with Zia Elena and her work with patients in Southern Italy, I mean, all of her therapies are heavily based in ritual. And I think there's just something to be said about the context of spirituality, the context of touching, of song, of that connection that you have in that moment of healing. And I describe my own experience in the book of being healed by Don Antonio in the forest, and kind of dive into that in the book. But you're absolutely right that the kind of ritual aspects of healing is incredibly important.
Thank you so much. And I think that was also very clear in your presentation, that was such an important part of things. Mm-hmm. Another question on a related topic from Anna. I'm an anthropology student studying intercultural health models. Do you believe that the Western healthcare system can be integrated into traditional medicine within Indigenous communities in a way that respects and preserves that traditional knowledge?
I mean, that's my hope, right? I think the amazing thing about our current kind of Western medical paradigms is that a lot of the medicines that we rely on today originated in Indigenous communities. Those are compounds that we've now developed and produced in a pharmaceutical setting were originally, in many cases, from plants that were already being used by local people for similar purposes. So I think that the origins of medicine start there. Can they be effectively integrated? I hope so. I think my concern, though, is when they're integrated in a way that basically displaces traditional knowledge, which is what I saw in Peru, where introduction of, just focusing on the example of antihelmintics, introduction of those drugs, basically persisted, such that knowledge of how to use the local plants was lost, and had really serious health consequences. I think you have to be really careful. And I think this is something that public health officials should really examine carefully when working on programs to support public health in different communities.
Oh, sorry about that. Terrific. That's really wonderful to hear. Our next question, this is from the speaker. I come from Indonesia, and as we know, Indonesia is a tropical country with an abundance of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. As for traditional medicine, since our ancestor, we always consume herbs that comes from the Zingiberaceae family, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes, ginger family, yeah.
Known as jamu. In that culture,
yeah,
for medical uses. And the problem is nowadays in Indonesia, the development of these medicines, the development in Indonesia in general has somewhat sacrificed some of these endemic species that were originally found. So do you have any suggestions for overcoming that kind of situation when we have a conflict between development on one side and preserving biodiversity on the other?
Yeah, I mean, and I've had the great opportunity to travel to Indonesia and visited Sumatra a number of years ago, and such a beautiful, amazing place with incredible biodiversity. I think some of the challenges in Indonesia are definitely palm oil cultivation that's resulting in clearing of forest, which is putting at risk orangutan populations, but also many of these medicines that local people use from the forest. Jamu medicine is incredibly fascinating. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's based, again, there's a lot of gingers. These are kind of a lot of plant juices that are prepared and used in this medical context. It's hard to, how do you bridge that gap between development, economics, and preservation of culture? It's difficult. It's a difficult hurdle. And I think that it really depends on the context of that particular government and that particular culture. But this also speaks, I think, to the relevance and importance of ethnobotanists in different fields. I always tell my students, if you're looking for a way to integrate ethnobotany into a career, you can go into city planning, you can go into government, you can go into some of these different programs. And wouldn't it be great if we had more people higher up in politics and in government kind of negotiations that understood and appreciated the value of this kind of cultural knowledge? So I don't have a solution, but I do recognize it is a problem. Hope you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, it's like my mouse is having trouble. Thank you for your insights on all of that. Oh, Vanessa is back, not quite, okay.
I'm back,
Vanessa,
yes,
you're
thank
ready
you,
for the
Charles.
Are you ready for the last question?
I think we have 2 more questions to go. So Charles, why don't you were just starting a new question, and then I will follow up with my final question for you, Cassandra.
Great.
Very good, thank you. So you mentioned your mentor, Dan Antonio, one of your many mentors, and how this person lived off the land and used many medicinal plants for their benefits for health. Do you know much about the relative importance of eating, say, one key species versus the importance of eating many species of plants or using many species of plants for health? And do you know if there's any current investigation of that going on, that compromise between key plants or a broad and diverse diet?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think when I think about this, the first thing that comes to mind is diet, right? I think that in the diet, we need a diversity of plants to meet all of our nutritional needs. That's why, humans are amazing as omnivores. It allows us to consume what's available in different seasons. I get a lot of questions about what's the one plant I should take to improve my health? And I think the answer is there isn't just one plant. I think it's a way of living. I think it's not only about consumption of plants, I think it's also your relationship with plants. And I would encourage all the listeners, to challenge you today to do one thing. Have an interaction with a plant today. Maybe you go outside and you hug that oak tree in your backyard. Maybe you go sit in the grass and look at some of the weeds that are sprouting up and think about, could some of these be useful? By the way, many of them are. Like that dandelion you're trying to kill is actually very tasty and you should eat it, not just spray herbicides on it. That's my challenge. I think plants influence our lives in so many amazing ways, both through, as a food source, a source of our clothing, our structures, but also just on a deeper level. I think that's kind of one of the messages of the book too, is we need to foster that relationship with nature. Planetary health, or the health of our world, and human health are closely tied together. You can't have one without the other. And until humans build a real relationship with the world that they live in, they're not going to know or care about saving that world. And I think that our health is dependent upon our appreciation of the planet's health.
Thank you, Dr. Quave.
Thank you, Cassandra, for this wonderful, inspiring talk, and Ina for the beautiful introduction. There's more questions. We could go on for a while. Here's the book. I'm reading it even again this weekend. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
And I want to, there was one thing we didn't discuss I want to end with, and that is the importance. Could you say a last sentence about women in STEM and how you could see removing some of the barriers that women still have in that arena?
That's a great question. And I get into that in the book as well, because like anyone else that identifies as other, whether you're a woman in STEM or you're a minority or a disabled scientist, I think all of us have faced some pretty serious challenges. I discuss very openly what my challenges have been. So this is not an all rainbows book. I do talk real with truth about the challenges that I've encountered from sexism, from sexual harassment, and from bullying in the field. And I did that with the intent, well, when I wrote these things, I was actually scared. I was like, I don't want to scare women away from science because there's so much joy in science and so much to be reaped. But my editor, Georgia Bodnar, who's an amazing woman in publishing, she told me, beyond anything else, you have to speak your truth. So that's what I've done in the book. And I hope that my truth will serve as a guide to others as they encounter some of these challenges, whether they follow the same path as I did or not. But I do talk about it, and it is so important. And I hope that we can have more in-depth conversations about these issues because it's time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cassandra Quave. It has been a real privilege. Everybody learned so many new things. And as you all know, audience, this program has been recorded and you can check it out again online at the NYBG Lecture Library. Please join us again next week for another inspiring webinar on Friday, October the 29th, when we discuss Afro-Indigenous histories of food in the Bronx, namely the Carifuna plant knowledge, past and present. And together with Ina van der Broek, Dr. Ina van der Broek, and Cassandra and Charles Thurman, thank you all for joining. Until next week, stay well, stay green, and take great care. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.